Welcome to the overview video for Chapter 27, The Changing World of Post-War Music. Our learning objectives are, number 1, to name some of the most significant trends in the classical tradition after World War II, explain what is individual about each one, and describe pieces by some of the major composers. And number 2, to trace the new developments in jazz from the 1940s through the 1960s, and name the most significant musicians associated with those developments. After World War II, musicians took the traditions of jazz, popular music, and Broadway musicals in separate directions. From 1940 to 1970, several new styles of jazz emerged, while older styles continued. Financial support for big bands declined, and more musicians joined combos. Bebop, or bop, emerged in the early 1940s in New York City and was built around virtuosic soloists supported by small combos. A typical bebop combo had a rhythm section and one or more melody instruments. Combining traditional jazz elements with complex harmony and rhythm, chromaticism, and more improvisation, bebop was meant for attentive listening, not dancing. A characteristic example of bebop is Anthropology by Charles Bird Parker, 1920 to 1955, and Dizzy Gillespie, 1917 to 1993. In the 1950s, musicians pioneered new jazz styles, seeking paths for individual expression by extending the methods and ideas of bebop. A major figure in several trends was Miles Davis, 1926 to 1991. Ornette Coleman, born in 1930, and his quartet introduced free jazz, and John Coltrane, 1926 to 1967, developed a personal avant-garde style. By 1970, the jazz world had developed its own roster of classics, and it was treated as a kind of classical music, studied in written histories and in college courses and ensembles. Olivier Messiaen, 1908 to 1992, the most important French composer born in the 20th century, was also an organist and teacher who taught many important younger composers. He composed many pieces on religious subjects, such as Quartet pour la fin du temps, Quartet for the End of Time. Seeking to embody ecstatic contemplation in music, Messiaen focused on a few ideas that are juxtaposed rather than developed. He often wrote down bird songs in musical notation and used them in several compositions. Messiaen used modes of limited transposition to create contemplative music. Messiaen's harmony also avoids moving forward to a resolution. Rather, chord series are simply repeated to create a sense of stasis or meditation. He treated rhythm as a matter of duration, not meter, sometimes using repeated patterns of duration like those of medieval isorhythm. Messiaen also used devices he called added values, which produces units of irregular length and non-retrogradable rhythms, the same forward and backward. Messiaen preferred beautiful timbres and colorful harmonies. The English composer Benjamin Britten, 1913 to 1976, was concerned primarily with communicating ideas in his music, especially humanitarian concerns. Most of his choral music was conceived for church and cathedral choirs, schools, and amateur choruses. Britten was a homosexual, and several of his operas have themes related to homosexuality. He established his reputation with Peter Grimes, 1944 to 1945, the first English opera since Purcell's to enter the international repertoire. Britten's pacifism is expressed in his War Requiem from 1961 to 1962. Many 20th century composers developed individual styles without departing radically from the past. Seeking to communicate with as varied a public as possible, these composers often listeners' identifiable themes, harmony grounded in tonality, or neotonality, readably audible forms, and programmatic subjects or titles. One of the most successful of these composers was the American Samuel Barber, 1910 to 1981, who offered a novel blend of traditional tonality with modern resources. John Cage, 1912 to 1992, was the leading composer and philosopher of the post-war avant-garde. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Cage wrote numerous works for percussion ensembles and organized music in terms of units of time rather than pitch and rhythmic relationships. Cage's experimentation with timbre culminated in his invention of the prepared piano, essentially a one-person percussion ensemble. His best-known work for prepared piano is Sonatas and Interludes from 1946 to 1948, consisting of 16 sonatas, relatively brief movements, most in binary form without thematic returns, and 4 interludes. In the 1950s and 1960s, Cage created opportunities for experiencing sounds as themselves, not as vehicles for the composer's intentions. He used chance operations to make some of the decisions normally made by the composer in his Music of Changes for Piano from 1951 and other works. Different form chance is indeterminacy, in which the composer leaves unspecified certain aspects of the music, such as the precise notes and rhythm of the coordination of parts. By using chance and indeterminacy, Cage invites the listener to simply hear sound as sound and not expect the music to communicate meaning. Beginning in the 1950s, Cage created pieces that blurred the boundaries between music, other arts, and the rest of life. In his later years, he continued to innovate, but chance and indeterminacy remained constant tools. Among the composers associated with indeterminacy, Morton Feldman, 1926 to 1987, was an inspiration to others, including Cage. Associated with New York abstract expressionist painters, he learned to trust instinct and reject compositional systems and traditional forms of expression. December 1952, from 1952, by Earl Brown, 1926 to 2002, is a piece in graphic notation in which nothing is specified. After World War II, young composers in Germany and elsewhere turned to 12-tone methods, adapting them to their own purposes. Government and university support for serial music was crucial since there was never a large audience for it. The ideas fostered in centers for new music such as Darmstadt inspired experiments by composers in many countries. Beginning in the late 1940s, some composers applied serial procedures of 12-tone music to parameters other than pitch, such as duration and dynamics, resulting in total serialism. Milton Babbitt, 1916 to 2011, first applied serial principles to duration in his 3 compositions for piano from 1947. His music grew even more complex because of the maximum interrelatedness of its musical materials. Composers in Europe explored similar ideas independent of Babbitt. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, 1928 to 2007, used complex serial processes and continued to develop serial procedures. He also explored other directions combining serialism and other methods. Pierre Boulez, 1925 to 2016, developed new methods of deriving related rows from a basic row that provided him with flexibility and expressive potential. His best-known piece, Le Marteau sans Maltre, The Hammer Without a Master, from 1953 to 1955, fuses his serial methods with sensitive musical realization of the text. Virtually every composer who used serial procedures did so in a unique way, devising individual approaches and in many cases using different techniques from piece to piece. In the post-war years, a new generation of extraordinarily proficient performers encouraged composers to write pieces to challenge their skills. The new virtuosity is well represented by the series of works titled Sequenza by Italian composer Luciano Berio, 1925 to 2003. Each sequenza is for an unaccompanied solo instrument, and each was composed for a specific composer. Elliott Carter, 1908 to 2012, who also wrote music only the most proficient performers could play, developed what he called metric modulation. Cataners, from 2006 for solo piano is unusual for Carter because instead of his typical polyphonic and polyrhythmic textures, it consists of a single melodic line in 16th notes played as fast as possible. One prominent strand in 20th century music was the exploration of new musical resources. Some composers built new instruments or explored new scales. Harry Partch, 1901 to 1974, developed new instruments that could play a scale based on just intonation containing 43 notes to the octave. George Crumb, born in 1929, used ordinary instruments and objects to create new sounds. His unusual effects provide material for juxtaposition and variation and usually evoke associations. In Crumb's Black Angels from 1970, a string quartet is electronically amplified to produce surrealistic, dreamlike juxtapositions. Several Western composers became fascinated with Asian instruments, sounds, and textures, including Henry Cowell, Lou Harrison, and the Canadian-American composer Colin McPhee. Electronic recording, production, and manipulation of sounds were first explored in art music, but ultimately became more significant for popular music beginning in the 1960s. Pierre Schaeffer, 1910 to 1995, pioneered musique concrète, which entailed recording sounds, manipulating them, and assembling them into collages. Tape recorders became widely available in 1950, allowing composers to use a variety of tools to manipulate sounds. Some new sounds were produced electronically, beginning with electronic instruments like the theremin and the ondes martineau. Electronic music studios made possible a whole new realm of sounds. Some composers used recorded sounds alongside electronic ones, as in Gesang der Jugendlichen, Song of the Youths, 1955 to 1956 by Stockhausen. Verese's Poème électronique, Electronic Poem, 1957 to 1958, combined electronic sounds with recorded ones and represented the pinnacle of his concept of spatial music. Electronic sound synthesizers made the process of recording and mixing music easier, and in the mid-1960s, popular artists also began using them. The electronic medium gave composers complete, unmediated control over their compositions. Since audiences expected to have performers to watch and respond to, composers began to create works that combined pre-recorded tape with live performers, as in Babbitt's Philomel from 1964. Inspired by Verese's concept of spatial music and by electronic music, some composers wrote pieces based on interesting and novel textures organized by gradual or sudden processes of change. Ioannis Xenakis, 1922 to 2001, was among the first to write such music for acoustic instruments in works such as Metastasis from 1953 to 1954. Krzysztof Penderecki, born in 1933, wrote Threnody for the victims of Hiroshima from 1960, one of the best-known pieces based on textures and process. It uses high clusters, glissandos, and specific effects on string instruments to create music that sounds electronic. He also uses this technique in dramatic works. Finnish composer Kaija Saariaho, born in 1952, made her reputation in the 1980s and 1990s with works in the specialist tradition that focused on timbre, deriving harmonies from computer analysis of instrumental sounds, and combining live electronics with acoustic instruments. In her opera, L'Amour de Loin, from 2000, Saariaho applied her specialist-influenced musical style to the story of 12th century troubadour Geoffrey Rudel from around 1120 to 1147. For your 25-point quiz, I would know the following. Know about bebop. Know about Charlie Parker. Know about Anthropology by Charlie Parker. Know about Miles Davis. Know about Ornette Coleman. Know about cool jazz. Know about Messiaen. Know about Britain's opera Peter Grimes. Know about Samuel Barber. Know about John Cage. Know about indeterminacy and what it is. Know about chance and what it is. Know about Morton Feldman. Know about Circus by John Cage. Know about Darmstadt and its importance in post-World War II music. Know what total serialism is. Know about Babbitt and his 3 compositions for piano. Know about Berio and his sequenzas. Know about Carter and his metric modulation. Know about Harry Partch. Know what music concrete is. Know what a theremin is. Know about Xenakis. Know about IRCAM and spectralism. And that ought to do it. Good luck.